I was involved in a school shooting where one of my classmates passed away. However, the entire scenario turned out to be a prank, and I think my brother was the one behind it all. Plus, all updates. I was sitting in my engineering lecture when the sound of a shotgun firing off blasted outside, and everyone went into panic. I dived under my desk, while roughly 5 or 6 students all started running towards the giant metal structure at the front of the room to hide behind. All of these students managed to fit behind it, except for one. He was the frailest and smallest one, and was pushed out by the others. He was the only one out in the open, and he turned around and tried to force his way in underneath the professor's desk. However, our professor insisted there was only enough room for one, and he too pushed the student away. At that moment, he completely froze. He was out in the open, not moving for a solid 20 seconds, before he started clutching his chest. He collapsed on the floor and began having a fear-induced heart attack. Nobody rushed over to help him, as nobody was willing to risk their life for his, and we watched him pass away. The shooter, however, was still outside. At that moment, as selfish as it may sound, the only thing I could think of was that I needed to stay still, stay quiet, and not draw attention to myself. I was shaking so badly under that desk. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, and I couldn't breathe. My mind kept racing. What if the shooter came into our classroom next? I tried to control my breathing, but it was so hard. I could hear some of the other students around me crying and whispering prayers under their breath. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. As I'm crouched under the desk, trying not to lose it completely, my phone starts going nuts in my pocket. I can hear the same thing happening all around the room. Everyone's phones were buzzing like crazy. I pulled out my phone and checked the screen. There's this flood of notifications, text after text, coming in from friends, classmates, and even my parents. The first one was from my roommate, asking if I was okay because she heard there was a shooter on campus. Then another one popped up from some classmate I barely talked to, warning me to stay inside. And then there's the one from my mom, which just hits me like a ton of bricks. Please tell me you're okay. There's a shooter at your school. I'm so scared. Please call me as soon as you can, she said. Everyone was saying there was a shooter near the humanities building, which was the exact building we were in. I looked around the room and saw the same fear on everyone's faces. We were all huddled under our desks, staring at our phones. Some people are texting like crazy, trying to let their families know they're okay, while others are just sitting there, frozen in fear. I quickly texted my mom back to let her know I was okay, and would call her when I could. Eventually, the sound of sirens filled the air. Campus security and the police stormed the building. I could hear them shouting, their footsteps echoing through the halls as they cleared each room. When they finally got to our classroom, the relief I felt was so intense that I almost cried. They gave the all clear, telling us it was safe to come out from under our desks. I was still trembling as I stood up. My legs felt like they were made of jelly. We all stumbled out of the room. The hallway was a mess. Students were everywhere, some of them crying, others just staring blankly ahead. It took a while for the police to explain that there was no shooter, and that the 2 gunshots we heard was an accidental discharge by a campus security officer responding to a false report. But by then, it didn't matter. The damage was done. Our classmate was dead, and the entire campus was in shock. As soon as I could, I pulled out my phone and texted my brother Mark. He's also a student at the same university, and I needed to make sure he was okay. I texted him and asked if he was safe. It felt like an eternity before he replied, even though it was probably just a few seconds. He responded, and I could finally breathe. He said he was fine, locked down in another building, and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, but the truth was I wasn't. I don't think anyone on campus was fine after what had just happened. I saw my classmate pass away right in front of me. That night, I went to Mark's apartment. I needed to see him to know for sure that he was okay. When I got there, I expected him to be as shaken up as I was. I thought we'd sit and talk about what happened, but when he opened the door, he was different than I expected. He was eerily calm. He greeted me at the door, and I asked him if he was okay. He said that he was fine, and I followed him into the apartment. The place was a mess, which was strange for Mark. He was usually pretty tidy, but empty coffee cups and papers were scattered everywhere. It looked like he hadn't been taking care of himself, but he didn't seem to care. We sat down and I tried to talk to him about what had happened, but he kept deflecting. Every time I brought up the incident, he'd change the subject or give me some vague answer that didn't really say anything. It was frustrating, but I didn't want to push him too hard. I figured maybe he was dealing with it in his own way, and I just needed to give him some space. But over the next few days, things only got stranger. Mark became more and more secretive. He'd leave the room to take phone calls, and when I asked him who he was talking to, he'd just shrug and say it was no one important. He started avoiding certain parts of campus, especially where the incident occurred, even though he had a class in the humanities building twice a week. And every time I tried to ask him about it, he'd brush me off or get defensive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. It was like he was hiding something from me, and I hated it. I'd always been close with Mark, and we've never kept secrets from each other. So why was he acting like this now? When I heard him talking on the phone late one night, I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was going on. I crept down the hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible, and pressed my ear against his bedroom door. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he'd hear it. I strained to make out what he was saying, but his voice was muffled. I could only only catch bits and pieces, but then, clear as day, I heard 3 words that sent chills down my spine. Wasn't supposed to. I froze, trying to process what I'd just heard. Wasn't supposed to what? I thought of the possibilities, and none of them were good. I didn't dare stick around to hear more. I quickly tiptoed back down the hall and threw myself onto the living room couch, threw something on the TV, and tried to pretend I'd been watching it the whole time. A few moments later, I heard Mark hang up the phone. He walked into the living room, and I forced myself to act natural. But inside, I was freaking out, trying to piece together what those 3 words could possibly mean. I started to get suspicious. I knew something was going on, and I was determined to find out what it was. I started digging around, talking to people who knew him, trying to figure out what he was up to. It didn't take long before I found something that made my stomach drop. Mark had been spending a lot of time with a group of students notorious for pulling extreme pranks. These weren't harmless or funny, they were dangerous, the kind that could get people seriously hurt. The more I found out, the worse it got. I couldn't believe that Mark would get involved with people like that, but the evidence was piling up. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I had a gut feeling that this group had something to do with what happened that day on campus. I tried to confront Mark about it, but he just got more defensive and more evasive. It was like he was a completely different person, and I didn't know what to do. Then one night I went to his apartment again. I was determined to get some answers. When I got there, I heard voices coming from inside. Mark was arguing with someone, and they didn't know I was outside the door listening. What I heard made my blood run cold. They were talking about the incident, about how it was supposed to be a prank. They had staged the whole active shooter scenario as a joke, thinking it would be funny to cause chaos on campus. But things spiraled out of control when the campus security officer fired his gun, and Ryan had a heart attack. They never meant for it to go that far, but now someone was dead. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own brother had been involved in someone's death. I felt like I was going to throw up. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to burst into the room and confront him right then and there, but another part of me was too stunned to move. I waited until the other student left before I walked in. Mark looked up at me. His face went pale when he saw the expression on mine. He knew that I had heard everything. I instantly asked him what the hell did he do and what was going on. He tried to explain and justify it, but nothing he said made it any better. He kept saying it was just supposed to be a prank, that they never meant for anyone to get hurt. But that didn't change the fact that someone had died because of what they did. My classmate was dead, and it was partly Mark's fault. I felt like I didn't even know him anymore. I don't know how he could be so reckless. I was furious with him, but more than that, I was devastated. I had always looked up to Mark. Growing up, he was the kid adults loved. He always did the right thing, even when no one was watching. He was the kind of person who would always stand up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it meant putting himself on the line. The Mark I grew up with wouldn't have let things get this far, but somehow, somewhere along the line, something had changed. I was torn. Part of me wanted to protect him because he's my brother, and I love him, but another part of me knew that I couldn't let this go. What he did was unforgivable, and I knew that if I stayed silent, I would be just as guilty as he was. My classmate's family deserved justice, and the truth needed to come out, no matter how much it hurt. After a lot of sleepless nights and agonizing over what to do, I made the hardest decision of my life. I went to the authorities and told them everything I knew. It felt like a piece of me was being ripped out, but I knew I had to do it. I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent. The fallout was brutal. Mark was expelled from the university, along with the other students involved in the prank. Some of them were even charged with criminal offenses. The campus was rocked by the scandal, and my family was devastated. My parents were ticked off with me. They couldn't understand why I had turned in my own brother. They blamed me for ruining his life. Now my family is basically torn apart. Mark won't speak to me, and my parents barely look at me. I've never felt so alone in my life. I keep asking myself if I did the right thing, but deep down, I know I did. Ryan didn't deserve to die, and I couldn't let Mark get away with what he did. But it's still hard. It's hard to know that I'm the one who tore my family apart. I've tried to keep going, focus on my studies, and move forward, but it's not easy. Everywhere I go on campus, I feel like people are whispering about me, like they know what I did. I felt like the backlash of the incident fell in my lap, and I was getting punished worse than Mark had. I'd become an outcast. I tried not to let it get to me. I knew that what I did was the right thing, even if it didn't feel like it sometimes. I haven't spoken to Mark since he left campus. I don't know where he is or what he's doing now, and honestly, I'm too scared to reach out. I'm terrified that he hates me, that he'll never forgive me for what I did. I keep telling myself that time will heal everything, and that eventually, my family will come around and understand why I did what I did. But right now, that feels like a distant dream. Update. It has been almost a year since I spoke to Mark, and I just found out that he has been sentenced to 4 years in prison. I found this out from my mother, who called me to tell me what a terrible sister I am, and that if I just kept my mouth, her son would still be a free man. It hurt a lot to hear that, and I just hung up on her after not saying anything. I'm trying to deal with this, but it's a lot.